In June 1955, a New York investment banking vice president named Robert Gordon Wasson sat at night alongside his photographer Alan Richardson inside an adobe hut in the Mazatec village of Huautla de Jiménez in the Mexican state of Oaxaca, and took part in a nighttime ceremony led by a local healer named María Sabina, in which both men consumed mushrooms of the genus psilocybin gathered nearby. Wasson became, according to his own later writings, the first known American to take part in and document firsthand a traditional sacred mushroom vigil. And 2 years later, in May 1957, Life magazine published an extensive feature written by Wasson himself titled Seeking the Magic Mushroom, with photographs of the ceremony that reached millions of American homes, and that many historians of the counterculture point to as the symbolic starting point of modern psychedelic tourism and of the Western fascination with hallucinogenic mushrooms that followed.
What Wasson did not disclose in that article, and what would only come to light decades later through declassified documents, is that some of his later expeditions to Oaxaca received indirect funding from the United States Central Intelligence Agency, which was interested in exploring the potential of psychoactive substances within the mind control program known as MKUltra. Wasson himself insisted for the rest of his life that he had no idea about the true origin of those funds, channeled through an intermediary foundation. And researchers who have since reviewed the case agree there is no evidence he knew the real source of the money. But the episode leaves an uncomfortable question hovering over the very origin of American scientific and popular interest in mushrooms. Part of that curiosity, presented for decades as disinterested academic exploration, was born entangled with an intelligence program searching, among other things, for substances capable of destabilizing the mind of an interrogation subject. For María Sabina herself, the publication of that feature carried consequences she later described in interviews collected by Mexican anthropologist Álvaro Estrada as devastating for her community. Hundreds and later thousands of spiritual seekers, among them figures such as the Beatles or Bob Dylan, according to accounts from the period, traveled to Huautla de Jiménez during the 1960s, hoping to repeat the experience Wasson had described, profoundly disrupting the village's daily life and producing, as Estrada recorded from María Sabina's own words, a feeling of having been stripped of something sacred that had once belonged exclusively to her people. Before that journalist arrived, she said in one of those interviews, the holy children, as she called the mushrooms, never lost their power. Once the secret became known throughout the world, that power began to weaken. Before going on, a quick aside. If you're drawn to stories where a scientific or spiritual discovery hides interests far less clean than they first appear, subscribing helps keep investigations like this one coming your way. Back to the case. Humanity's relationship with mushrooms, however, doesn't begin with Wasson or with psilocybin, but thousands of years earlier. And one of the most striking material clues to that early relationship turned up entirely by accident in 1991, when a German couple hiking through the Ötztal Alps on the border between Austria and Italy found a naturally mummified human body partly emerged from the ice. That body, which archaeologists named Ötzi, and which radiocarbon dating placed at roughly 5,300 years old, carried among his personal gear two distinct fungal fragments, tied with leather strips to a strap hanging from his belt. One of those fragments belonged to Fomes fomentarius, commonly known as tinder fungus, used since prehistoric times to carry glowing embers, thanks to its ability to smolder slowly without a visible flame for hours. The second fragment, more intriguing still, turned out to be Piptoporus betulinus, the birch polypore, a fungus with antibiotic and antiparasitic properties confirmed by modern analysis, leading several researchers to suggest Ötzi may have carried it as a medicinal remedy, possibly connected to the intestinal parasites that a later analysis of his stomach contents did in fact confirm he was suffering from. Long before Ötzi, and on much more speculative ground, Wasson himself developed during the 1960s and 1970s
a hypothesis that still fuels debate among Indologists and mycologists. The possibility that soma, the sacred drink mentioned more than 100 times in the Rig Veda, the oldest religious text of Hinduism, composed roughly 3,500 years ago in the Punjab region, was in fact a preparation derived from Amanita muscaria, the red-capped, white-spotted mushroom any reader today would instantly recognize from its constant presence in children's stories and video games. Wasson argued in his 1968 book, Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality, that certain Vedic verses, which describe soma as something that grows neither from root nor from seed and is consumed strained through wool, fit the characteristics of a mushroom better than any known plant of the region. The hypothesis never achieved a definitive academic consensus, partly because no Vedic text explicitly names a mushroom, but it's still cited today as one of the most influential and most contested theories about the possible role of psychoactive fungi in the very origin of one of the world's oldest living religious traditions. In Siberia, where Amanita muscaria grows abundantly beneath birch and pine trees, several indigenous peoples of the region, among them the Koryak and the Chukchi, maintained well into the 20th century a practice documented by Russian and later Western anthropologists that today sounds almost unbelievable to anyone hearing it for the first time. Because the mushroom's active compounds pass through the human digestive system nearly intact and become concentrated in urine, shamans and ritual participants would literally drink the urine of those who had already consumed the mushroom directly. A practice that allowed the psychoactive effect to be extended among several participants from a limited number of gathered mushrooms. Especially valuable in communities where Amanita muscaria was scarce during certain seasons of the year. Stepping away from psychoactive mushrooms and back onto purely culinary ground, the story of the common white button mushroom, Agaricus bisporus, the most widely eaten fungus in the Western world today, has its own accidental origin, documented with considerably more historical precision. During the reign of Louis XIV of France, the royal gardener Jean-Baptiste de la Quintinie, in charge of the famous gardens of Versailles, discovered around 1650 that wild mushrooms sprouted spontaneously on beds of horse manure and compost used to artificially heat melon patches, and began deliberately experimenting with propagating that mycelium from one bed to another, laying the groundwork for what would become, a century later, an organized commercial crop around Paris. Toward the end of the 18th century and throughout the 19th, Parisian mushroom growers found in the old abandoned limestone quarries beneath the city, the very same quarries that gave rise to the Paris catacombs, the perfect environment for large-scale cultivation. A constant temperature between 11 and 15 degrees year-round, total darkness, and stable humidity, conditions no open-air crop could match consistently. By 1900, according to historians of French agriculture, hundreds of kilometers of underground galleries beneath Paris and its surroundings were devoted to commercial mushroom growing, giving rise even to the English name champignon de Paris, still used today on restaurant menus in several countries to refer to this variety, though actual French production gradually shifted during the 20th century toward rural areas with lower labor costs, leaving the old Parisian quarries today, for the most part, converted into tourist attractions or storage facilities with no connection whatsoever to active mushroom farming. While Parisian growers were perfecting the underground cultivation of the white button mushroom, on the opposite end of Eurasia, another tradition of fungal cultivation was already centuries into its own development. Shiitake, Lentinula edodes, grown in China since at least the Song dynasty, around the 12th century, according to agricultural records attributed to the writer Wu Sangui, who described techniques for inoculating cut deciduous logs with this mushroom's spores through calculated axe strikes designed to open cracks in the bark without damaging the inner wood, a method still used today, with minor variations, on traditional shiitake farms in both China and Japan. In Japan, where cultivation on Konara oak logs is documented systematically from the Edo period onward, starting in the 17th century, dried shiitake, known as hoshi shiitake, became a regional export product so valuable that it was used as a form of payment for feudal taxes in certain mountainous provinces where rice farming was harder than forestry.
Cultivation technique underwent its own industrial revolution in the 20th century, when Japanese researchers, starting in the 1940s and 1950s, developed methods for inoculating logs with pure spores grown in a laboratory, replacing reliance on the chance arrival of wild, wind-borne spores with a far more predictable and scalable process. Since the 1980s, much of the world's shiitake production, today led overwhelmingly by China, according to figures from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, is grown on compacted sawdust blocks enriched with nutrients rather than whole logs, a method that shortens the 3 to 5 year production cycle a traditional log requires down to just a few months, multiplying the global supply available but producing, according to criticism from Japanese artisan growers organized in associations defending the traditional method, a mushroom noticeably different in flavor and texture from shiitake grown on wood aged outdoors for years. If the white button mushroom represents the most domesticated and standardized face of the edible fungal world, the truffle sits at the opposite extreme, a fungus that, despite centuries of attempts, still largely resists truly controlled, predictable cultivation, which has kept both its price and its aura of mystery practically intact since ancient Rome. Pliny the Elder himself, in his first-century encyclopedia, Natural History, devoted a chapter to speculating about the origin of truffles, going so far as to suggest they formed from lightning striking the ground, a theory that sounds quaint to us today, but reflects just how genuinely baffling ancient naturalists found an organism capable of growing entirely underground, with no stem, no leaves, and no visible part on the surface to give away its presence. The French court developed, over the 17th and 18th centuries, a particular obsession with the black Perigord truffle, Tuber melanosporum, which King Louis XV himself, according to palace chronicles of the period, collected and boasted of having personally found during hunts organized specifically for that purpose. The traditional search technique relied on female pigs, naturally drawn to the truffle by a chemical compound, androstenone, which is chemically similar to a pheromone present in male pig saliva during courtship, which explains why sows dig at the ground so enthusiastically upon detecting the scent of a ripe truffle, buried sometimes 30 centimeters below the surface. The obvious problem with this method, documented in numerous accounts from traditional harvesters in Perigord and in Italy's Piedmont region, is that the sow, driven by what she perceives as a sexual stimulus, tends to eat the truffle the moment she unearths it, forcing the harvester to physically snatch it away at the exact instant of discovery. A race against the animal itself that led most professional truffle hunters to gradually replace pigs with trained dogs over the course of the 20th century, since dogs can learn to point at a truffle without trying to eat it. That shift toward dogs, however, brought with it a safety problem the French and Italian press still report on to this day: the deliberate poisoning of truffle-hunting dogs by rival harvesters, or by thieves looking to steal the best-trained animals outright. The Italian region of Alba in Piedmont, epicenter of the white truffle Tuber magnatum, considered by many gastronomes the most valuable variety in the world, with prices at annual auctions that have topped 100,000 euros for a single large specimen, has recorded, according to local truffle hunter associations, dozens of cases each year of dogs poisoned with meat laced with nails, ground glass, or rodenticide, deliberately left in forest areas frequented by rival harvesters. The Italian press coined the term truffle war to describe the intensity of these territorial disputes, which in some cases, reported by local Piedmontese newspapers, have escalated into direct physical threats between harvesters over access to forest areas considered especially productive and kept secret for generations within specific families. The truffle's extreme value,
combined with the near-total difficulty of visually verifying its geographic origin once it's been sliced or worked into a processed product, has also generated, over the past 2 decades, a parallel fraud market, well established by independent scientific research. A 2016 study by researchers at Aberystwyth University in Wales, which applied DNA analysis techniques to dozens of commercial products labeled as European white or black truffle and sold in supermarkets and restaurants across several countries, found that a significant percentage of those samples actually corresponded to much cheaper Asian species, mainly tuber indicum from China, with an aroma and market value far inferior to their European equivalents, yet sold under the name and price of the original European variety. This kind of substitution, extremely difficult to detect without laboratory analysis, places the truffle in the same category of food fraud we've already seen with olive oil or grated Parmesan cheese, with the added twist that here, the profit margin for the counterfeiter can be even larger, given the price gap between the two species. The same family of wild mushrooms that can make a counterfeiter rich can also kill, with no fraud required at all, anyone who mistakes a harmless species for its toxic twin. And few recent cases illustrate that risk with as much media attention as the one that unfolded in the small town of Leongatha in the Australian state of Victoria in July 2023. A woman named Erin Patterson invited her former father-in-law, former mother-in-law, and the latter's sister and brother-in-law to lunch, serving individual beef Wellingtons filled with a mushroom paste that, as later toxicology tests determined, contained Amanita phalloides, commonly known as the death cap, the species responsible, according to mycotoxicological estimates cited in scientific publications, for the majority of human deaths from fungal poisoning recorded worldwide. 3 of the 4 guests, including both of Patterson's in-laws, died days later in hospital from acute liver failure, while the 4th survived after weeks of hospitalization and a liver transplant. The case, followed with enormous attention by media across the English-speaking world during the trial, held in 2024 and 2025, was particularly unsettling because Amanita phalloides isn't easily told apart from similar edible species by an inexperienced forager, and because the prosecution argued during the trial that Patterson knew the mushroom's toxicity and had deliberately worked it into the recipe, a charge a Victoria jury ultimately accepted, finding her guilty of 3 counts of murder and 1 of attempted murder in a verdict handed down in 2025. Regardless of that particular case's legal outcome, toxicology services in Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States have reported a sustained rise over the past decade in accidental Amanita phalloides poisonings, which several of those same services suspect is linked to the boom in amateur wild mushroom foraging driven by online enthusiast communities, many of which share photos and identification guides that don't always capture the microscopic details distinguishing this deadly species from its edible relatives. Crossing the Pacific and leaving the European truffle behind, another high-value wild mushroom reveals a story of labor exploitation rarely mentioned alongside its delicate aroma. Matsutake, Tricholoma matsutake. Deeply prized in Japanese cuisine for more than 1,000 years, traditionally given as a gift symbolizing status during the autumn season, with top-quality specimens fetching hundreds of dollars apiece at Tokyo auctions. Since the 1980s, when Japan's domestic matsutake production went into decline due to changes in traditional forest management and diseases affecting the red pines with which the mushroom forms its symbiotic relationship, Japan has imported growing quantities from the forests of the American Pacific Northwest, particularly in Oregon, where the mushroom grows wild under similar ecological conditions. Anthropologist Anna Lowenhaupt-Tsing reconstructed, in her influential 2015 book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, how commercial matsutake harvesting in Oregon's forests relies heavily on a workforce made up largely of Southeast Asian refugees and immigrants, among them Hmong communities from Laos, Cambodians, and Mien, many of whom arrived in the United States after armed conflicts in their home countries during the 1970s and 1980s, and found in seasonal wild mushroom picking one of the few accessible economic activities that required neither fluency in English nor educational credentials recognized in their new country. As Ching describes in her field research, these pickers live during the harvest season, which lasts only a few weeks each autumn, in makeshift camps inside the national forest itself, competing with one another for access to the best mushroom-producing patches. Within an informal market where middlemen buyers, many of them also Asian immigrants with direct ties to Japanese exporters, set daily prices that swing sharply according to demand in the Tokyo market, leaving the pickers themselves with very little real bargaining power over the final price of a mushroom that, after passing through several intermediaries, can multiply its value many times over before reaching a specialty shop in Japan. Singh also describes episodes of sporadic violence among rival pickers, recorded throughout the harvest seasons, driven by territorial disputes over public forest areas considered especially productive. A pattern that bears a notable parallel, though on a smaller scale and without the involvement of organized criminal structures as in Italy, to the European truffle war described earlier. In both cases, a wild mushroom impossible to fully domesticate, whose value is extremely sensitive to demand from distant markets, ends up generating, on the very ground where it grows, tensions and conflicts that the end consumer, buying the packaged product thousands of kilometers away, never witnesses or even imagines. The global surge of interest in mushrooms, both medicinal and recreational, has produced over the past decade a supplement market that, according to recent independent research, suffers from a fraud problem far less publicly known than that of Asian truffles, but confirmed with equal scientific rigor. A 2022 study published in the Journal of Dietary Supplements, which analyzed dozens of commercial supplements sold in the United States under labels such as Lion's Mane, Reishi, or Cordyceps, found that a substantial share of those products contained minimal or outright undetectable amounts of the bioactive compounds theoretically justifying their sale, and that, in many cases, the product's actual main ingredient was grain starch, used as a growth substrate for the mycelium, that is, the underground vegetative part of the fungus, far cheaper to produce at scale than the visible fruiting body that actually concentrates the compounds of interest, yet marketed under the same name and at prices comparable to extracts made from the whole mushroom. This practice, known within the industry as mycelium on-grain supplementation, isn't illegal in most countries, as long as the label technically names the fungal species used, though consumer advocacy organizations, such as the Clean Label Project, have repeatedly pointed out that the ambiguity in labeling, which rarely specifies whether the product comes from the fruiting body or from mycelium grown on grain, leaves most buyers with no practical way to tell a genuinely concentrated extract apart from a supplement that, in practice, offers little more than oat or rice flour with trace amounts of real mushroom. A transparency problem closely resembling the one we've already seen with adulterated olive oil or Parmesan cheese cut with cellulose in earlier investigations into other foods. Alongside this supplement market of questionable efficacy, the past decade has also brought a significant regulatory shift regarding the psychoactive mushrooms we opened this story with. In November 2020, voters in the state of Oregon approved, by referendum, Measure 109, making Oregon the first state in the country to legalize the supervised use of psilocybin, the active compound in psilocybe mushrooms, within licensed therapeutic centers and with a certified facilitator required to be present. A regulatory model entirely different from the recreational legalization previously applied to cannabis in the same state. Cities such as Denver, Colorado, followed a similar path, starting in 2019 through decriminalization, not full legalization, of personal possession of psychoactive mushrooms, and several clinical studies published between 2020 and 2023 in medical journals such as the New England Journal of Medicine have found preliminary evidence that psilocybin, administered under strict medical supervision, may have beneficial effects in treating depression resistant to conventional treatments, reopening a field of clinical research that had remained essentially frozen in the United States since the substance was classified in 1970 under the most restrictive category of federal controlled substances law. in the political backlash that followed the very cultural popularization Wasson had helped set in motion more than a decade earlier. Before closing this account, it's worth pausing on an episode far older and far darker in humanity's relationship with fungi, one that likely shaped European history in a way rarely acknowledged outside specialized mycology. Ergot, caused by the fungus Claviceps purpurea, capable of infecting rye crops in particularly damp years and producing, within the infected grain, a set of alkaloids with severe neurological effects when consumed in bread made from that contaminated flour. During the European Middle Ages, periodic outbreaks of what chroniclers of the time called Saint Anthony's Fire, named for the saint associated with the religious order that ran hospitals dedicated to treating those afflicted, caused mass episodes of convulsions, hallucinations, and dry gangrene in the limbs so severe that numerous monastic accounts describe entire villages where dozens of residents lost fingers, hands, or whole feet within weeks, with no one at the time understanding the connection between these devastating symptoms and the bread that formed the very basis of their daily diet. American historian Linda Caporail proposed in a 1976 article published in the journal Science a hypothesis that still fuels debate among historians today: that the episodes of spasms, visions, and erratic behavior recorded during the Salem, Massachusetts witch trials of 1692 might be at least partly explained by mass ergot poisoning, given that the documented climate conditions in the years leading up to the trials in that particularly damp region of New England would have favored the fungus's growth on local rye crops. Caporail's hypothesis never won unanimous backing, and several later historians have pointed out that the exact timeline of symptoms recorded in Salem's court documents doesn't quite fit the typical clinical picture of ergotism, but the proposal is still regularly cited as one of the most debated examples of how a microscopic fungus, invisible to the naked eye on infected grain, may have decisively shaped the course of a historical episode explained for centuries in purely religious and social terms.
Not every fungus that altered the course of human history did so through destructive accident. In September 1928, Scottish bacteriologist Alexander Fleming returned from vacation to his laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital in London and found, among a stack of unwashed Staphylococcus culture plates he'd left behind before leaving, one plate contaminated by a blue-green mold that had grown spontaneously, probably drifting in from a neighboring lab studying fungal allergies, and that had completely destroyed the bacterial colonies around it. Fleming identified the mold as belonging to the genus Penicillium and published his observations in 1929. But for nearly a decade, his discovery remained a laboratory curiosity with no real clinical application, since neither he nor anyone on his team managed to purify the active substance in sufficient quantity or with the stability needed to test it in human patients. The true transformation of that mold into a life-saving medicine came a decade later, thanks to the work of a team at Oxford University, led by Australian pathologist Howard Florey and German-born Jewish biochemist Ernst Chain, who picked up Fleming's nearly forgotten discovery in 1939 and, in the middle of the Second World War, developed large-scale cultivation and purification methods that for the first time made it possible to produce penicillin in clinically useful quantities. Facing a shortage of industrial resources in bombed Britain, the Oxford team turned to American drug manufacturers to scale up production, and by the time of the D-Day landings in 1944, Allied penicillin production had already reached several 100,000 doses a month, a volume that, according to estimates from historians of military medicine, drastically cut mortality from bacterial infection in war wounds that barely a generation earlier, during the First World War, had killed more soldiers than bullets or shrapnel themselves. Fleming, Florey, and Chain shared the 1945 Nobel Prize in Medicine for the discovery. And Fleming himself warned in his acceptance speech, with a clarity that now sounds almost prophetic, of the risk that careless use of the drug would eventually breed bacteria resistant to it,
precisely the same phenomenon of antimicrobial resistance that today worries the World Health Organization in connection with antibiotics used routinely in industrial livestock farming. Another fungus, this one with no ambiguity at all about its documented historical impact, irreversibly transformed the forest landscape and the rural economy of much of the United States during the first half of the 20th century. Cryphonectria parasitica, the fungus behind what's known as chestnut blight. Accidentally introduced around 1904 alongside imported Japanese chestnut nursery stock at the Bronx Zoo in New York.
The American chestnut, Castanea dentata, which until then made up 1 in every 4 trees in the forests of Appalachia and sustained an entire rural economy built on its rot-resistant timber and abundant edible nuts, was left completely defenseless against a pathogen it had never co-evolved with. And within barely 40 years, by mid-century, the blight had wiped out, according to the U.S. Forest Service's own estimates, more than 3 billion mature trees, a near total functional extinction of one of the dominant species of the eastern North American forest, achieved by a microscopic organism within the span of a single human generation, and one that left thousands of Appalachian rural families without the seasonal income they'd relied on from gathering chestnuts. Turning to fungi that infect animals rather than plants or grain, the genus Ophiocordyceps offers one of the most studied and most unsettling examples of parasitic behavioral manipulation in all of biology. Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, which specifically infects certain species of carpenter ants in tropical forests, penetrates the insect's nervous system and, according to research published by mycologists at Pennsylvania State University over the past decade, alters its behavior with such precision that the infected ant abandons its usual colony, climbs to a specific height and orientation relative to the sun above the surrounding vegetation, and clamps its mandibles onto a leaf or stem in what researchers call the death grip, fixing its body in that exact position just before dying, so the fungus can then grow through its head and release spores from an optimal position to infect other ants passing below. This cycle, described in almost cinematic detail in the scientific literature for more than a century, but popularized to a mass audience only in recent years thanks to nature documentaries and its fictionalized adaptation as the central premise of the video game and television series The Last of Us, shows just how far the fungal kingdom's mechanisms of biological control outstrip anything science fiction had imagined before mycologists first described it in nature itself. Another fungal discovery, this one much more recent and carrying a very different symbolic weight, suggests certain fungi can not only survive conditions that would kill most living organisms, but actually feed on them. In 2007, a team of microbiologists led by researcher Ekaterina Dadachova, then at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York, published in the journal PLOS ONE an analysis of black fungus samples collected inside and around the containment sarcophagus of reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear plant in Ukraine, site of the worst civilian nuclear accident in history in 1986. Those samples, belonging to species such as Cladosporium sphaerospermum and Cryptococcus neoformans, showed in the lab a capacity to grow faster when exposed to ionizing radiation levels several times above natural background, a behavior Dadachova's team attributed to large amounts of melanin, the same pigment found in human skin, present in these fungi's cell walls, apparently able to capture the energy of gamma radiation and channel it into metabolic processes not yet fully understood by science, in what the researcher herself dubbed radiosynthesis, in deliberate parallel with plant photosynthesis. The finding, replicated and expanded by later research that recorded colonies of these same black fungi growing directly on the interior walls of the destroyed reactor, sparked serious scientific interest in these organisms' potential, both for bioremediation of radioactively contaminated areas and for future long-duration space missions, where cosmic radiation is one of the greatest health risks astronauts face. The International Space Station even hosted an experiment in 2018 with Cladosporium sphaerospermum,
to assess its potential as a partial biological shield against radiation.
Even so, several environmental mycologists have cautioned that the gap between a fungus that survives and grows slightly better under intense lab radiation and a real practical application in bioremediation or radiation shielding remains considerable, and that much of the popular media coverage of these radiation-eating Chernobyl fungi has oversimplified in a way reminiscent of the excessive enthusiasm the Wood Wide Web would generate years later. A genuinely fascinating biological phenomenon that's still far from becoming the technological solution the more optimistic headlines suggest. One last front of the contemporary relationship between humans and fungi deserves mention before closing this account, because it illustrates a pattern of media hype followed by scientific correction that recurs with striking frequency in the recent history of popular mycology. The so-called underground fungal network, or Wood Wide Web, a term coined by the journal Nature in 1997 to describe the mycorrhizal networks connecting the roots of different trees within the same forest through shared fungal filaments. Pioneering research by Canadian forest ecologist Suzanne Simard, begun in the 1990s and widely popularized through her 2021 memoir, proposed that these networks allow a forest's largest and oldest trees, which she herself dubbed mother trees, to actively transfer carbon, nutrients, and even chemical warning signals to younger seedlings with less direct access to sunlight, an image that captured the public imagination and spread widely through documentaries, talks, and news features as evidence of a kind of cooperation, even conscious communication among trees through their associated fungi. However, an extensive critical review published in 2023 in the journal Nature, Ecology, and Evolution by a team led by researchers Justine Karst, Melanie Jones, and Jason Huxema, after systematically examining the scientific literature underlying the most widely repeated claims about the Wood Wide Web, concluded that much of that popular narrative rested on a far smaller number of field studies than media coverage suggested, that several of the original experiments lacked the controls needed to rule out alternative explanations for the observed phenomenon, and that the leap toward concepts like conscious communication or maternal care between trees amounted to an anthropomorphic interpretation that went considerably further than the data itself could rigorously support. This review doesn't deny that shared mycorrhizal networks exist between trees, a phenomenon documented and accepted in forest ecology for decades. But it does firmly challenge much of the more dramatic, more viral narrative that had, in the preceding years, turned underground fungi into protagonists of a story of generosity and plant communication that, according to this review, was considerably simpler and less generous than the popular imagination had built out of an overly enthusiastic reading of the available evidence. That same pattern of runaway enthusiasm, followed by a colder adjustment to commercial reality, repeated itself, almost in parallel, in the industry built around mycelium-derived materials, which, over the past decade, promised to revolutionize sectors as different as fashion, packaging, and construction. Companies such as Bolt Threads, founded in California in 2009 and funded with more than $200 million in venture capital, according to trade media, developed a material called Milo, made from cultivated, pressed mycelium, designed to mimic the texture of animal leather, and struck partnership deals with luxury fashion brands such as Stella McCartney and Adidas. Even so, in March 2023, the company announced an indefinite pause in Milo production, citing difficulties scaling the manufacturing process to a cost competitive with conventional synthetic leather, a setback several industry analysts, quoted by trade press covering sustainability, read as a sign that much of the investor enthusiasm surrounding fungal materials had, during the years of peak excitement, outpaced the actual industrial production technology needed to sustain it at scale, leaving competitors such as MycoWorks, which still runs its own mycelium leather line under the name Rishi, among the few players in the sector still operating commercially as of 2024. Returning to that night in June 1955 in Huautla de Jiménez, when a New York banker and a Mazatec healer
shared a ceremony neither could have imagined would end up published in a mass circulation magazine, partly funded by an intelligence agency, and followed decades later by state referendums, clinical trials, and a global supplement industry of dubious composition. It's hard not to notice the pattern running through this entire fungal story. From the tinder fungus tied to Ötzi's belt, to the Asian truffle sold under a European name in an ordinary supermarket. An organism that grows in the dark, invisible until the exact moment of its fruiting, is still generating today the very same kind of secrecy, dispute, and quiet substitution it was generating 5,000 years ago. Only now, packaged, certified, and sold under a label that rarely tells the whole story